So let's talk about how to create this Wing Geo very quickly. I'm going to grab my Z-sphere. We'll hide everything else and then just kind of track down wherever that wing is. There we go. All right, so I'm going to turn on edit topology, and what we're going to do here is basically just kind of capture the rough shape of it. And we're really not looking for too much in the way of fidelity. Just kind of want to, let me turn the color off here. It might make it a little bit easier to see what's going on. Just need to, like this is, this line is going across there. So I'm just going to grab the middle of it or something. Triangles are fine. This is not going to have a normal map relative to the low poly anyway. I mean, I guess maybe that's not an entirely accurate statement, but triangles do not matter. We're really just trying to catch the rough silhouette. So where there's a big change in the curvature, we'll grab that. And you gotta, in this case, like you gotta hop around a little bit just because of where the geo you can click on is. Like that's probably, we could just scoot that up a little bit. And we'll just roughly finish up here. Just hitting the really big changes as we move across the surface here. Okay, oops, let me connect this one. So if I hit solo, you can see, I guess I need to connect this up here. That's what the geometry that we just created looks like. And what we need to do here is we'll go ahead and make it apply mesh 3D. And I'll just append it back in. Tap A on my Z-sphere and delete the topology. We don't need it anymore. Here's our new geometry. So what needs to happen here is the geo needs to just go a little bit beyond the surface of the high poly. So we just kind of need to bring it out like this. And then you do sort of want to make an effort to keep it kind of in line with what's going on there. But the most important thing is it just has to go outside of the boundary of what the high poly is doing. And this will, the reason for this will become clear pretty soon. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll just pause the video while I do this for the rest of the geo. Hopefully you kind of get what I'm talking about. All right, so you can see we get just a little bit of space. Doesn't have to be excessive. We're just looking for a very clear gap between the edge of the low poly and where the high poly begins. And I'm just making a little bit of an effort here to make sure that I'm still mostly intersecting the high poly. So that's all we need to do there as far as the low poly is concerned. So once that's done, we can export the high and the low. In this case, there's only one piece of geo for the high and one piece for the low, so we don't really need to worry about our naming convention too much. But I'm going to go ahead and I'll just delete this because I've already got one in the scene. But that's how we make it. And then once you got it, let's see, we'll go and take a look at ours just to kind of reaffirm that that's what's going on there. And we've already looked at the UVs. So what we want to do is head over to Painter. All right, so here's the low poly baking scenario that we talked about in the last video. So I am going to go to my texture set settings, and we'll go to bake mesh maps. And for now, I'm just going to make sure that everything is set up correctly. So I'll just use a relatively low output size, and we will go find the correct geo, which in this case is going to be body high 1 and 2. I'll talk about that in a second as well. That's kind of useful. And then the anti-aliasing, I'm going to leave it none because this improves the quality but slows it down a little bit. And the match, we need to set this to by mesh name. And finally, we've got to come over to our ID here. By default, it's going to be set to material color, and we want to use the vertex color, which is those beautiful colors that we saw in the Zbrush file. So now that that's all set up, we can go ahead and bake our selected textures. All right, and we can see that the wing looks weird, which is expected, and everything else looks okay in terms of clearly everything is kind of showing up. If we wanted to, we could kind of run through our mesh maps and look at the normal map and like, yeah, everybody's kind of being represented and looks fine. And for instance, like the wing is not showing up on the side of the bug, which is what would happen if we forgot to enable using the mesh name. So that looks good. We're going to go ahead and I'm going to bump this up to 2048 and we'll go ahead and rebake it. Okay, and I forgot to mention, I didn't just set this to 2048. I also increased the subsampling to 2x2. So this would be, tapping the M key goes to this view mode. With the exception again of the wing, which is what we're going to be talking about here in a second. This is fine. The resolution here of these the bakes looks good. You can see the shadow of the wing is being cast, which would probably not be what we were looking for if this was an actual asset. We want to go through and disable AO casting on other objects, but in this case, it doesn't really matter. We just want to figure out how to fix this wing. So what's going on here? If we look at the normal map that we're actually generating, I think I can, yeah, if I mouse over, maybe we get a better look at it, but it's just off screen. Anyway, you can kind of see it's like, basically what it's doing is it's taking whatever the pixel value is at the edge of the UV shell and just pushing it away from the UV shell. And the reason it does that is for MIP maps. And if you're not familiar with MIP maps, you could probably look it up pretty easily. Basically, like as an object gets further away from the camera, we're going to be swapping in lower res versions of the textures. And if there are seams, you can end up with like black lines if there is no padding here. This is what's called padding. So we just need to basically generate a version of the bake that doesn't have any of this stuff on it that we can use to create an opacity map or an alpha map in Photoshop. So I'm going to go back to my bake mesh maps here. It takes a little bit of time to do this. And if I increase the quality settings, which is what I'm going to do, it's going to take an even longer time. So we want to find the cheapest map that we can bake. And then we only need the one. Like we don't have to bake everything out. So I'm going to disable everything except the ID. Because all ID does is it looks at vertex color. And I'm going to kick this up to 4K, and I'm going to increase this to 4x4. That should be fine. And we could probably even go any higher, or even higher than that. It doesn't really make that much difference. Just as long as it's high enough, we'll know once we get it into Photoshop if it was high enough. So we're just going to do the ID here, and we're going to go ahead and hit Bake Selected Textures. Sorry, I forgot one very important setting. This right here, 32, that's the dilation width. That's what this is right there. So we need to set this to 0 or 1 or whatever the lowest value is because we don't want there to be any dilation. It needs to be either exactly what's being seen by the bake or nothing at all. So now with the ID selected, we'll go ahead and bake selected textures. All right, so what that looks like now, if I go to the ID, is we get this. So it's nice and clean. We know exactly where the geometry ends. So now we just have to export this. So we'll go to Bake Mesh Map, or sorry, we've already done that. We'll go to Export Textures and go ahead and set our export directory. And what we're going to be doing here in the output template is we're going to look for mesh maps, and that's just going to be our bakes. And then I'm going to set this to 4K, and we will export. Okay, there's one thing I need to do before I can jump into Photoshop, and that's generate a UV snapshot of the wing UVs. So I've got the UV editor open here. I'm just going to go to the image menu here, and then go to UV snapshot. Go ahead and set your file name to whatever you want, but make sure that you add a .tga to the end of it or .png. Otherwise, you might get something strange out of Maya. And then make sure that your size in X and Y is going to be 4096. And hit apply, and you should have an image that you can open in Photoshop I've got both of the images open here in Photoshop. I'm going to go ahead and hit Control A to select this whole image and Control C to copy it. And then into the ID map, I'm going to hit Control V. For now, I'm going to hide it. We'll go ahead and select the background. And what I want to do is everywhere that we're either like this green or this lighter green color, I want to make that white, and I want everything else to be black as far as the boundary, well, a little bit past the boundary of the UVs. And then everything else needs to be white. So hopefully that'll make a little bit more sense here once we take a look at it. So I'm going to select all of the black stuff. And make a new layer. And the black stuff we want to be black, because that's going to be transparent. So that's what that looks like. And then this area here, I actually want all this stuff to be white, because that's going to be opaque. So I'll just fill that with white. And now we have the issue of trying to figure out where to make everything else opaque. Because again, where it's white, it's opaque, and where it's black, it's transparent. And none of this stuff here should be transparent. It's all got to be opaque. So that's what we're going to use this for. I'm going to go ahead and select that layer, and then select the empty space outside of the UV shell. And I'm going to do a little contraction on it to get a little bit of breathing room with the shell. So we'll do a modify contract, and 5 pixels is probably fine. And then I'm going to come back over to this layer and fill the whole thing with white. So now we have a very nice opacity mask that we can use in Painter, and we will take a look at how to set that up in the next video.